A cop arrests a 9-year-old black girl, accusing her of something she didn't do. But when she asks to make one call, everything changes. The voice on the other end isn't just any father. It's the head of the FBI, a man with the power to turn her entire world upside down. What happens when a small-town cop learns the hard way that this little girl is far more than he bargained for? Will justice prevail, or will the truth remain buried? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The gray morning light filtered weakly through the thin curtains of apartment 4B, casting soft shadows across the walls covered in hand-drawn pictures. Lions with colorful manes pranced next to smiling elephants, while graceful giraffes stretched their long necks toward carefully sketched clouds. Each drawing bore the distinct style of 9-year-old Amira Suleiman, whose artistic talent filled every available space in their small but cozy home. In the kitchen, the gentle clink of plates and the warm aroma of toast mixed with the sound of rain pattering against the windows. Amira sat at their small round table, her legs swinging beneath her chair as she watched her mother, Layla, rush between the toaster and the counter, still adjusting her blue scrubs. "Mom, you forgot to tuck in the back of your shirt again," Amira pointed out, taking a bite of her peanut butter toast. Layla quickly tucked in her scrub top, shooting her daughter a grateful smile. "What would I do without my little helper?" She glanced at her watch for the third time in 5 minutes, her forehead creasing with worry. "Sweetie, I know the library doesn't open until 9, but I have to start my shift early today. Will you be okay?" Amira nodded, used to their morning routine on days when her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. "I've got my umbrella," she said, pointing to her favorite purple umbrella propped by the door. "And my sketchbook. I'll be fine." Layla paused her rushing around to look at her daughter, her eyes soft with both pride and concern. The apartment might be small, with its worn carpet and slightly crooked kitchen cabinets, but it was filled with love, and Amira's artwork made it special. A particularly detailed drawing of a penguin family hung on the refrigerator, held up by mismatched magnets. "Make sure you wear your rain boots," Layla said, grabbing her keys from the hook by the door. "And your warm jacket, the blue one, not the thin sweater." "I know, Mom," Amira said, already pulling on her boots. They were decorated with little yellow ducks that she had painted herself. She carefully packed her sketchbook into her backpack, making sure it was safely wrapped in a plastic bag to keep it dry. Next went her water bottle, decorated with stickers of various animals, and finally, she zipped up the front pocket containing her colored pencils. Layla handed her a brown paper lunch bag. "I made your favorite, turkey and cheese with the crusts cut off." She knelt down and pulled Amira into a tight hug, the familiar smell of her lavender lotion mixing with the clean scent of hospital scrubs. "Be careful walking to the library, okay? Stay on the sidewalk and—" "Look both ways before crossing the street," Amira finished, hugging her mother back just as tight. "I will. Promise." With one last kiss on Amira's forehead, Layla hurried out the door, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Amira waited until she couldn't hear them anymore before shouldering her backpack and picking up her purple umbrella. Outside, the morning air was crisp and cool. The rain fell in a light drizzle, creating tiny ripples in the puddles dotting the sidewalk. Amira opened her umbrella, the purple fabric spreading out like a protective wing above her head. She carefully made her way down the quiet street, occasionally seeking shelter under the awnings of closed shops or beneath the branches of large oak trees when the rain picked up. The city was different this early in the morning. Everything seemed softer, quieter. The usual rush of cars was replaced by an occasional whoosh of tires on wet pavement. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few early morning joggers and people hurrying to work with coffee cups clutched in their hands. Amira took her time, stopping now and then to watch raindrops slide down leaves or to observe how the morning light made the wet sidewalk shimmer. These were the kinds of details she liked to include in her drawings, the little things that made the world more magical. When she finally reached the library, its large brick building was still dark and quiet. The closed sign hung prominently in the window, and the parking lot was empty except for a few puddles reflecting the gray sky. Amira made her way to the side of the building, where a wide awning provided shelter from the steadily falling rain. Setting her backpack down carefully, she pulled out her sketchbook and settled cross-legged on the dry concrete. The sound of rain falling created a soothing rhythm as she opened to a fresh page. Her colored pencils scattered around her in a rainbow array as she began to draw. First came an elephant, its trunk held high holding a tiny pink umbrella. Then a giraffe appeared, wearing rain boots that stretched up its long legs. A family of rabbits hopped across the page, each carrying matching polka-dotted umbrellas. Amira hummed softly as she worked, adding splashes and puddles around her character's feet. The rain began to fall harder, creating a curtain of water beyond the awning's protection. But Amira barely noticed, lost in her own world of umbrella-toting animals. Her purple umbrella lay closed beside her, water dripping from its tips onto the concrete. Across the street, a woman in a beige raincoat walked her golden retriever, which shook its wet fur every few steps. The woman slowed her pace as she noticed Amira sitting alone by the library wall. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched the young girl drawing, apparently unsupervised at this early hour. With a frown deepening the lines around her mouth, she pulled her phone from her coat pocket, her eyes never leaving Amira. But Amira didn't see any of this. She was too busy adding the finishing touches to a penguin wearing yellow rain boots and carrying a blue umbrella, completely absorbed in her artistic world where animals danced in the rain and every creature had a colorful umbrella to keep them dry. The rain drummed steadily against the library's awning, as Amira added delicate whiskers to a cat wearing a rainbow-striped umbrella. Her colored pencils lay scattered around her like fallen autumn leaves, each one carefully placed within easy reach. The morning air had grown colder, but she barely noticed, wrapped up in her artistic world where even the grayest day held magic and color. The low rumble of an engine cut through the peaceful morning. A white and blue police cruiser rolled to a stop in front of the library, its tires splashing through puddles. Amira looked up from her drawing, her hand pausing mid-stroke. Through the rain, she could see the car's windshield wipers moving back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. The driver's door opened with a heavy creak. Officer Rick Danner stepped out, his polished black boots landing firmly in a puddle. Water dripped from the brim of his police cap as he straightened up, adjusting his belt with practiced authority. His face was set in hard lines, his mouth pressed into a thin, disapproving line beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. Amira sat very still as the officer approached, his footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. She carefully set down her green-colored pencil. She had been using it to draw grass around her umbrella-carrying animals. Her mother had always taught her to be polite and respectful to police officers, so she looked up at him with a small, nervous smile. "What are you doing here?" Officer Danner's voice was sharp and cold, like the morning air. He towered over her, his shadow falling across her sketchbook. "Good morning, sir," Amira said quietly, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "I'm waiting for the library to open. My mom had to go to work early today." Danner's eyes narrowed as they swept over her backpack, her purple umbrella, and the scattered art supplies. "Where are your parents?" he demanded, ignoring her explanation. His hand rested on his belt, inches from his handcuffs. "My mom's at work. She's a nurse at Memorial Hospital," Amira explained. She reached for her backpack, movements slow and careful. "I have my student ID from school. Would you like to see it?" Officer Danner took a step closer, his boots inches from her sketchbook. "This neighborhood doesn't need any trouble," he said, his voice low and threatening. "We get enough complaints about loitering as it is." "But I'm not," Amira started to protest, but Danner cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Stand up," he ordered, unclipping the handcuffs from his belt. "Hands behind your back." Amira felt her heart beating faster, but she did as she was told. Her colored pencils rolled away as she stood, some disappearing into nearby puddles. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, tight and unyielding. She didn't resist or pull away, even though fear made her hands tremble. "But my things," she said softly, looking at her scattered art supplies and her beloved purple umbrella. Officer Danner roughly gathered her backpack and sketchbook, not bothering to collect the colored pencils that lay abandoned on the wet concrete. He gripped her arm firmly, steering her toward the police cruiser. The rain fell harder now, soaking through Amira's jacket and plastering her hair to her forehead. The back door of the cruiser opened with a heavy click. Danner pushed her head down as he guided her into the back seat, just like she'd seen in TV shows. The door slammed shut behind her with a final-sounding thud. Inside the cruiser, everything smelled like leather and something sharp and chemical. The seat was hard and smooth beneath her. Through the barrier between the front and back seats, she could see Officer Danner sliding into the driver's seat. He didn't reach for his radio or make any calls. Instead, he simply started the engine and pulled away from the curb. They didn't drive toward the police station. Instead, Danner turned away from the library and began taking unfamiliar streets, moving slowly through the rain-soaked morning. Past closed shops with dark windows, past empty parking lots where puddles reflected the gray sky, past houses where lights were just beginning to come on as people started their day. Amira watched raindrops race down the window beside her, creating tiny rivers that merged and separated in endless patterns. Her sketchbook lay on the seat next to her, and she wished her hands were free so she could draw the way the rain made everything look soft and blurry, like a watercolor painting. "You need to learn your place." Officer Danner's voice cut through the quiet hum of the engine and the steady swish of windshield wipers. His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, cold and hard. "This isn't the kind of neighborhood where we let people just hang around wherever they please." Amira stayed silent, her fingers gripping the edge of her sketchbook as tightly as she could with her hands cuffed behind her. She watched another raindrop trace its way down the window, following its path until it disappeared. The cruiser turned onto another unfamiliar street, moving further and further from the library, from her mother, from everything familiar and safe. Through the rain-streaked windows, the world outside became strange and unknown. Officer Danner's voice droned on, lecturing about respect and authority and knowing where you belonged. But Amira focused on the rain, on the gentle tap-tap-tap against the roof of the cruiser, on the way the water made everything outside look like one of her watercolor paintings, soft and blurred around the edges. She held onto her sketchbook like a lifeline as Officer Danner continued to drive through the gray morning, his words washing over her like the rain outside, cold and relentless. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, but she remained still and quiet, watching the unfamiliar streets pass by through tear-blurred eyes. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the police cruiser as Officer Danner drove through unfamiliar streets. His voice filled the small space, lecturing with a mix of condescension and barely contained anger. "You see, some folks just weren't raised right," he said, his eyes meeting Amira's in the rearview mirror. "They don't understand that there are places meant for certain people and places that aren't." He turned another corner, moving deeper into an area Amira didn't recognize. This library, for instance. Nice neighborhood. Quiet neighborhood. We need to keep it that way. Amira sat quietly, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Her sketchbook lay beside her on the leather seat, pages slightly bent from the rough handling. Outside, the gray morning had turned into a maze of unfamiliar buildings and empty streets. The rain made everything look distant and strange, like a blurry photograph. "Can I call my dad now?" Amira's voice was small but clear in the confined space of the cruiser. Danner's laugh was sharp and dismissive. It bounced off the windows and the barrier between them, making the space feel even smaller. "Sure, kid. What's he do? Security? Janitor?" His tone dripped with mockery as he glanced at her again in the mirror. With careful movement, despite her cuffed hands, Amira managed to work a small, water-stained card from her back pocket. The edges were slightly worn, but the number was still clear. She had memorized it long ago but always kept the card with her, just as her father had taught her. The phone rang once. "This is Assistant Director Ibrahim Suleiman, FBI." The voice that came through was deep, calm, and carried unmistakable authority. "Who is this, and why are you holding my daughter?" The change in Officer Danner was immediate and dramatic. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The smug superiority that had filled his voice moments before evaporated like morning mist. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Before he could form a response, a sharp electronic ping cut through the silence. A second phone in the cruiser's console lit up with a GPS alert. The screen showed a blinking dot moving slowly through the streets, their exact location. Ibrahim had already activated the FBI's emergency child tracking beacon from Amira's phone. Danner's eyes darted between the road and the GPS display, panic replacing his earlier arrogance. His breathing became rapid and shallow as he realized the gravity of his situation. The cruiser's speed decreased as his confidence crumbled. Suddenly, two black SUVs with tinted windows appeared as if from nowhere. Their sleek forms cut through the rain with purpose, one pulling in front of the cruiser while the other boxed it in from behind. The SUV's movements were precise and coordinated, leaving Danner no choice but to stop. Doors opened on both SUVs before they had fully stopped. FBI agents emerged into the rain, their movements swift and practiced. Their dark jackets had FBI printed in bold yellow letters across the back, and each wore a body cam that gleamed in the gray morning light. They moved with practiced efficiency, weapons drawn but held low. "Officer Danner," a commanding voice cut through the rain. "Exit the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." Danner's face had lost all color. His hands shook as he put the cruiser in park and slowly raised them from the steering wheel. The confidence and authority he had wielded so carelessly minutes before had vanished completely. A female agent approached the back door on Amira's side. Her movements were careful and deliberate as she opened it, trying not to startle the young girl inside. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly. "Let's get you out of those cuffs, okay?" Amira nodded, clutching her sketchbook as best she could with her hands still bound. The agent helped her step out of the cruiser, shielding her from the rain with her own body. With gentle movements, she unlocked the handcuffs, carefully removing them from Amira's wrists. On the other side of the cruiser, Danner was being ordered out of the driver's seat. He emerged slowly, his movements stiff and uncertain. Two agents approached him, their weapons still drawn but pointed at the ground. "Hands behind your back," one agent commanded. The same handcuffs that had been on Amira's wrists minutes before were now being closed around Danner's. The metallic click seemed especially loud in the rain-soaked morning. "Officer Richard Danner, you are under arrest," the agent began, his voice clear and professional. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Amira stood under the protection of the female agent's umbrella, watching as the man who had tried to intimidate her was now the one being led away. She held her sketchbook close to her chest, its pages slightly damp from the rain but still intact. The morning's drawings of animals with umbrellas were safe inside, a reminder of how differently this gray morning had turned out than she had expected. The rain continued to fall, but it felt different now, cleansing rather than cold. The female agent kept her arm protectively around Amira's shoulders as they watched Danner being secured in the back of one of the FBI vehicles. His face was a mask of disbelief and fear, so different from the threatening expression he had worn earlier. The rain drummed steadily against the roof of the FBI vehicle as Amira sat in the back seat, now wrapped in a thick, navy blue blanket that bore the FBI insignia. A steaming cup of hot cocoa warmed her hands, its sweet aroma filling the car's interior. Her sketchbook remained close, pressed against her side like a shield. Agent Rivera, the same female agent who had helped her from Danner's cruiser, glanced at Amira in the rearview mirror as she drove. Her dark eyes were kind, and her voice was gentle when she spoke. "You're very brave, you know that?" Agent Rivera said softly. "Most kids wouldn't have stayed so calm." Amira's fingers tightened around the paper cup, feeling its warmth seep into her hands. She watched the buildings pass by through rain-streaked windows, familiar streets slowly replacing the unknown ones from earlier. The hot cocoa's sweetness lingered on her tongue, but she remained quiet, processing the morning's events. "Your dad talks about you all the time," Agent Rivera continued, keeping her tone conversational and light. "He showed us your art exhibition at school last month. The one with the penguin family? That was really special." A ghost of a smile flickered across Amira's face at the mention of her artwork, but she remained focused on the passing scenery, her sketchbook held close against her side. The blanket's weight felt comforting, like a protective hug around her shoulders. The vehicle turned into a secure parking structure beneath a tall federal building. Agent Rivera used a key card to pass through several checkpoints, each one bringing them deeper into the building's secure area. The underground garage was well lit and clean, with rows of official vehicles parked in designated spaces. As they pulled into a parking spot, Amira saw a familiar figure waiting near the elevator. Ibrahim Suleiman stood tall in his gray suit, his usual commanding presence softened by the concern evident in his stance. The moment Agent Rivera opened the car door, Ibrahim moved forward, his long strides carrying him quickly to his daughter. He knelt down beside the vehicle, bringing himself to Amira's eye level. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her in a warm, secure embrace. The familiar scent of his cologne, subtle notes of cedar and amber, enveloped her as she buried her face in his shoulder. His hand gently cradled the back of her head, a gesture of protection he'd practiced since she was small. "You did everything right, sweetheart," he murmured, his deep voice gentle and reassuring. "Everything exactly right." The FBI assistant director was gone. This was purely her father speaking, his relief evident in every word. Amira's grip on her sketchbook loosened slightly as she leaned into her father's embrace. The morning's tension began to slowly unwind from her shoulders, though she still held herself carefully, as if unsure of her surroundings. Through the open door of a nearby conference room, activity could be seen. Several agents moved purposefully around a table covered with documents and computer screens. In an adjacent room, visible through interior windows, Officer Danner sat at a metal table, his previous arrogance replaced by nervous fidgeting. A federal investigator approached Ibrahim holding a tablet. Her expression was professional but carried an undercurrent of controlled anger. "Sir, we've confirmed that Officer Danner made no contact with dispatch this morning. There's no record of the arrest in the system. He was operating completely off book." Ibrahim's jaw tightened slightly, but his embrace remained gentle. He pulled back just enough to look at Amira's face, his eyes warm and protective. "Let's go home, sweetheart. Your mom's shift ends soon, and I think we could all use some rest." The drive home was quiet, with Ibrahim behind the wheel of his personal vehicle. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the streets were beginning to fill with weekend traffic. Amira watched the familiar buildings of their neighborhood come into view, each one a welcome sight after the morning's uncertainty. Their apartment welcomed them with its comfortable familiarity, Amira's artwork on the walls, family photos on shelves, and the soft throw pillows on the couch that her mother had picked out. Ibrahim ordered their favorite takeout from the Mediterranean place down the street, and soon the apartment filled with the aromatic scent of shawarma and fresh pita. At the dinner table, Amira picked at her food while Ibrahim watched her with patient eyes. The sound of rain against the windows created a peaceful backdrop to their meal. After a few quiet moments, Ibrahim gestured to the sketchbook that hadn't left Amira's side all day. "May I see what you were working on this morning?" he asked softly. Amira nodded, carefully opening the sketchbook. The pages were slightly wrinkled from the rain and the morning's events, but her drawings remained clear and vibrant. She flipped through them slowly. A bear holding an umbrella while fishing, a giraffe sharing its umbrella with a mouse, and then the one that made Ibrahim pause. It was a simple but touching scene, a raccoon holding an umbrella over a duck in the rain. The raccoon's expression was kind, and the duck looked grateful, its feathers dry under the umbrella's protection. The details were careful and deliberate, showing the skill that made Amira's art so special. "This one's my favorite," Ibrahim said, his smile warm and genuine. Amira returned the smile, though her eyes showed the fatigue of the long day. When bedtime came, Ibrahim tucked her in with extra care. He pulled her favorite quilt up to her chin and made sure her stuffed elephant was within reach. The rain continued its gentle rhythm outside, creating a soothing lullaby against her bedroom window. Through the gap in her curtains, the subtle reflection of red and blue lights caught her attention. A black FBI SUV sat parked across the street, its presence both reassuring and protective in the rainy night. Ibrahim noticed her glance and smoothed her hair gently. "Get some rest, sweetheart," he said softly, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "You're safe now." The early Sunday morning light filtered through the study's blinds, casting thin stripes across Ibrahim's desk. He sat surrounded by stacks of files and reports, his laptop screen casting a blue glow on his tired face. The Bureau's overnight team had pulled every record they could find on Officer Rick Danner, and what Ibrahim discovered made his stomach turn. His fingers moved methodically through digital records, each click revealing another disturbing entry. Complaint after complaint filled his screen. 12 in total over the past decade. The details varied, but the pattern was clear. Families of color reporting harassment, intimidation, and unexplained detentions. Each case had been marked as either dismissed or resolved internally, with no further action taken. Ibrahim leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of his laptop and the occasional rustle of paper as he cross-referenced physical files with digital records. His coffee sat untouched, having gone cold hours ago. A particular detail caught his attention, a recurring name that appeared at the bottom of each closed case. Colonel Frank McConnell, Precinct Captain. Ibrahim's eyes narrowed as he dug deeper into McConnell's background. The connection emerged quickly. McConnell and Danner had served together in the Army, same unit, same deployment. Now, every complaint against Danner passed through McConnell's desk, and every complaint disappeared. Ibrahim reached for his phone, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the anger building in his chest. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Sarah Chen, his trusted contact at the Department of Justice. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Sarah," Ibrahim spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of urgency without raising its volume. "I need an immediate internal review and officer audit. Not just Danner. I want everything on the entire precinct chain of command, particularly Captain Frank McConnell." He outlined the pattern he'd discovered, his words precise and measured. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. The call ended with her assurance of immediate action. The sound of the front door opening drew Ibrahim's attention. Layla's familiar footsteps moved through the apartment, still quiet despite her exhaustion after a long hospital shift. Ibrahim stood from his desk, his joints protesting the hours of sitting. He found Layla in the kitchen, still in her scrubs, looking drained from her overnight shift. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and shadows hung under her eyes. Ibrahim approached her carefully, knowing the news he had to share would only add to her burden. "Layla," he said softly, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." They sat at the kitchen table as Ibrahim explained everything. Amira's arrest, Danner's actions, the FBI intervention. With each detail, Layla's expression shifted from confusion to horror to anger. Her hands trembled as she gripped her cup of tea. "I shouldn't have left her alone," Layla whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "If I had just waited, if I had found someone to watch her." The sound of small feet padding across the floor interrupted her self-recrimination. Amira stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her curly hair tousled from sleep. She moved to her mother's side, wrapping her small arms around Layla's shoulders. "It's okay, Mama," Amira said softly, her voice carrying a maturity beyond her years. "I wasn't alone." Layla pulled her daughter close, tears falling silently as she held Amira tight. Ibrahim watched them, his heart heavy with both love and determination. The morning light grew stronger, filling the kitchen with warmth as mother and daughter held each other. Later, after Amira had returned to her room to sleep more, Ibrahim noticed her sketchbook clutched tightly in her arms as she dozed. The sight of his daughter finding comfort in her art, even after everything that had happened, both warmed and pained his heart. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. Sarah Chen's number flashed on the screen. Ibrahim stepped into his study, closing the door softly behind him. "Ibrahim." Sarah's voice was tense. "You're going to want to see this in person." She continued, each word making Ibrahim's jaw tighten. "We've flagged 4 cases with striking procedural similarities to Amira's, one in particular." She paused, and Ibrahim could hear papers shuffling. A black teenager was held in Danner's custody for 6 hours. No record of the detention, no calls to parents, nothing in the system. The kid just disappeared for those hours before being released. Ibrahim's free hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white with tension. The morning sun continued to stream through his study window, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold anger settling in his chest. Monday morning arrived with a stark brightness that felt almost harsh after days of rain. The sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Elementary's hallways as Amira walked through the front doors, her purple backpack hanging heavy on her shoulders. Her steps were measured careful, as if testing each tile before committing her weight to it. The familiar corridor felt different now. Eyes followed her movement, some curious, others wary. Whispers trailed in her wake like autumn leaves scattered by footsteps. Amira kept her gaze forward, clutching her sketchbook closer to her chest like a shield. "Did you hear?" A voice carried from a cluster of fifth graders near the water fountain. "That's the jail girl." The words hit Amira like a physical thing, making her shoulders hunch slightly. She quickened her pace, her sneakers squeaking against the freshly waxed floor. More whispers followed, some too quiet to hear, others just loud enough to sting. "Amira!" The voice cut through the murmurs like sunshine through clouds. Lily burst from the crowd, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she ran. Before Amira could respond, Lily's arms were around her in a fierce hug that nearly knocked them both over. "I was so worried." Lily pulled back, her blue eyes wide with concern. "Mom told me what happened. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? I can't believe they—" "Jail girl," someone muttered as they passed, cutting off Lily's stream of questions. Lily whirled around, her face flushing red. "Hey, don't you dare!" "It's okay," Amira said quietly, tugging on Lily's sleeve. "Let's just go to class." They made their way to Ms. Paxton's fourth grade classroom, arriving with plenty of time before the bell. Amira slid into her usual seat near the window, Lily taking her place in the desk next to her. The familiar arrangement should have been comforting, but something felt off-kilter, like a picture hanging slightly crooked. Ms. Paxton stood at her desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she took attendance. When she reached Amira's name, she looked up, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Tardy," she announced, marking something in her book. "But," Lily started to protest, "we're 5 minutes early." Ms. Paxton's pen paused. "Did I ask for your input, Lily?" The classroom fell silent. Amira sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the surface of her desk where someone had carved their initials years ago. She traced the letters with her gaze, trying to make them mean something, anything else than what was happening. The morning dragged on through math and reading. During free time, while other students chatted or worked on assignments, Amira pulled out her sketchbook. The familiar weight of her pencil felt right in her hand and she began to draw. A small rabbit emerged on the paper, wearing a police officer's hat but looking confused about it. The rabbit's expression captured exactly how Amira felt, lost in a role it never asked for. Ms. Paxton's shadow fell across her desk. "Maybe," the teacher said, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby students to hear. "You should focus on real work, not this nonsense." Amira's pencil stopped moving. She slowly closed her sketchbook, sliding it under her math worksheet. Around her, she could feel the stares of her classmates, could almost taste their curiosity and judgment in the air. When lunch finally arrived, Amira and Lily found a quiet corner of the cafeteria. Lily pulled out her lunch, a perfectly packed bento box that her mother always prepared, while Amira opened the brown paper bag her father had filled that morning. "My parents are so mad about what happened," Lily said between bites of her sandwich. "Like, really mad. Mom was on the phone all weekend talking about it. They want to talk to the school about it." Amira's stomach twisted. She set down her half-eaten apple. "Please don't." "But Amira, what they did was wrong. The police and now the school—" "Please." Amira's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want it to be a big thing. I just want everything to be normal again." Lily frowned, her sandwich forgotten. "But it's not normal, it's not fair. Ms. Paxton is being mean to you and everyone's whispering and—" "That's why I don't want more attention," Amira said, picking at the crust of her sandwich. "It'll just make everything worse." The rest of the school day passed in a blur of sideways glances and whispered comments. Amira kept her sketchbook closed, her head down, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. When the final bell rang, she almost ran to meet her father's car in the pickup line. That evening, in the comfortable living room of the Winters home, Lily's mother, Sarah, sat on her couch with her phone pressed to her ear. Her free hand gripped a notepad where she'd been writing down points she wanted to address with the school principal. "Yes, I understand it's after hours," Sarah said, her voice clipped and professional. "But I need an explanation for why parents weren't notified when a student was arrested on their way to school. This is a serious safety concern." She listened for a moment, her expression darkening. "Not involved in political matters? This isn't political. This is about student safety. The arrest occurred while she was waiting for your library to open." Another pause. Sarah's pen scratched furiously across her notepad. "So, because it was off campus, you're washing your hands of it? A 9-year-old student was wrongfully arrested while waiting for your facility to open, and you're saying that's not your concern?" The response from the other end of the line made Sarah's face flush with anger. She stood up, pacing the length of her living room. "No, this is absolutely unacceptable. You'll be receiving an official complaint first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm not the only parent concerned about this." She ended the call with more force than necessary, then immediately opened her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she began drafting an email to the Parent-Teacher Association and several other parents she knew would be concerned about the situation. From the hallway, Lily watched her mother work, a mixture of pride and worry on her face. She thought about Amira's plea for normalcy, about the way her friend had seemed to shrink into herself all day. But she also thought about the unfairness of it all. How could things ever be normal again if nobody stood up to say it was wrong? The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of Ibrahim's signature pasta sauce, bubbling gently on the stove. Amira sat at the table, her math homework pushed to one side, replaced by her ever-present sketchbook. Ibrahim stirred the sauce one final time before joining her, 2 plates of spaghetti in hand. "How was school today?" he asked, settling into his chair. Amira pushed a meatball around her plate. "Okay, I guess." Ibrahim noticed the slight droop in her shoulders, the way her eyes stayed fixed on her food. He glanced at her sketchbook, remembering how Miss Paxton had dismissed her artwork. "Would you mind showing me what you were drawing this morning?" Amira hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She reached for her sketchbook, carefully opening it to a fresh page. The drawing took up most of the space. A majestic tiger, standing tall in the rain, holding an oversized umbrella. Beneath it, a tiny mouse looked up gratefully, completely dry despite the storm around them. Ibrahim studied the image, noting the careful details, the gentle expression in the tiger's eyes, despite its powerful frame, the way the mouse stood straight and dignified, even in its vulnerability. The rain, drawn as delicate lines that seemed to curve around the umbrella's protection rather than fall through it. "This is beautiful, Amira," he said softly. "The way you've drawn them. There's so much feeling in it." Amira's fingers traced the edge of the page. "The tiger could hurt the mouse if it wanted to," she said quietly. "But instead, it chooses to help." Ibrahim felt his heart tighten at the deeper meaning in her words. He saw what she had captured in her art. The imbalance of power, the choice between harm and protection, the dignity of the small in the face of the mighty. His daughter had taken her experience and transformed it into something profound. "Have you drawn others like this?" he asked. Amira nodded and began flipping through the pages. There was a giraffe sharing its leaf with a butterfly caught in a storm, an elephant using its trunk to shelter a family of rabbits, a wise old owl extending its wing over a frightened field mouse. "These tell a story," Ibrahim observed. "They're all about protection, about choosing kindness over power." "I wrote it down too," Amira said, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out several sheets of lined paper, covered in her neat handwriting. "It's called Waiting in the Rain." Ibrahim took the papers carefully as if handling something precious. The first line caught his breath. "It was a morning like any other until they told me I didn't belong." He read on, following Amira's words as she described, through the metaphor of her animals, what it felt like to be small in a big world, to face unkindness, and to find unexpected allies. The story was simple but powerful, told with the honest clarity that only a child could achieve. "Amira," he said when he finished reading, "this is important. What you've created here, both the words and the pictures, it could help other kids who feel the way you did." She looked up at him, a spark of interest in her eyes. "Really?" Ibrahim nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I have a friend, Jessica Chen. She used to work with me at the bureau, but now she's an editor at a children's publishing house. Would you be okay if I showed her your story?" Amira thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Do you think she'll like it?" "I think she'll see exactly what I see, something special." Ibrahim snapped careful photos of both the artwork and the story pages, then composed a text to his former colleague. "Jessica, I have something important to share with you. My daughter has created something remarkable, and I believe it needs to be seen. Can we talk?" The response came quickly. "Call me." While Amira finished her dinner, Ibrahim stepped into his study to make the call. He explained the situation, both the incident that inspired the story and the powerful way Amira had processed it through her art. "Send me everything," Jessica said immediately. "This is exactly the kind of story we need right now. Raw, honest, but told in a way that children can understand and relate to. We could have this fast-tracked for publication if you're both interested." Ibrahim felt a surge of pride and possibility. "Let me talk to Amira about it. This needs to be her decision." Across town at the 14th precinct, a very different scene was unfolding. The FBI task force arrived as the evening shift was starting, their presence announced only by the flash of badges and the sound of sturdy boots on linoleum. Officer Rick Danner was in the break room when they came. He watched through the glass as agents in suits moved through the bullpen with purpose, carrying boxes and evidence bags. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand. In Captain McConnell's office, the task force leader, Agent Martinez, stood with unwavering authority as two of her team members began downloading the contents of the captain's desktop computer. "You can't do this," McConnell protested, his face reddening. "This is my precinct. You need proper—" Martinez dropped a thick file on his desk, cutting him off mid-sentence. 12 kids, Captain. That's 12 too many." McConnell stared at the file, his complexion paling as Martinez continued to speak. 12 incidents involving minors, all involving Officer Danner, all mysteriously resolved under your supervision. 12 families who filed complaints, only to have them dismissed or buried. 12 children who learned to fear the very people sworn to protect them. The computer technician signaled that the download was complete. Another agent emerged from the records room, pushing a cart loaded with case files. Every incident involving Danner over the past decade. McConnell sank into his chair, the weight of his choices visible in the slump of his shoulders. His military bearing crumbled as he watched years of covered-up misconduct being boxed and labeled as evidence. 12 kids, Martinez repeated, her voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. That's 12 too many. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Riverside High School's computer lab, where Marcus Ellison sat working on his robotics project. The 17-year-old's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, programming commands for the small robot he and his team were building for the state championships. A news alert popped up in the corner of his screen, something about a police officer's suspension. Marcus almost ignored it, but the word FBI caught his attention. He clicked the link, and his whole body went rigid. There, in the middle of the article, was a photo of a young girl named Amira Suleiman. But it wasn't the girl that made his blood run cold. It was the name beneath the photo, Officer Rick Danner. The mouse slipped from his trembling fingers. Memories he'd tried so hard to suppress came rushing back. The cold metal of handcuffs, hours of driving in circles, threats whispered in the darkness of a police cruiser. His robotics teacher, Mr. Chen, noticed his distress. "Marcus, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus couldn't answer. He grabbed his backpack and rushed out of the lab, barely making it to the bathroom before emptying his lunch into the toilet. After splashing cold water on his face, he pulled out his phone and called his mom. "Can you pick me up? Now, please?" 20 minutes later, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea his mother had made. The steam rose in lazy spirals as he struggled to find the words. "Baby, you're scaring me," his mother Teresa said softly. "What's wrong?" Marcus pulled up the news article on his phone and slid it across the table. His mother read it, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as understanding dawned. "That officer," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Danner. He's the one who... That night after robotics club. 2 years ago." Teresa's hand flew to her mouth. "The night you came home so late? When you said you got lost?" Marcus nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I wasn't lost, Mom. He stopped me, said I was casing houses. I tried to show him my robotics team ID, tried to explain I was just walking home from practice, but he wouldn't listen." The story poured out of him, how Danner had handcuffed him without explanation, put him in the back of the cruiser, and driven around for hours. How the officer had lectured him about knowing his place and staying in his lane. How he'd threatened to plant evidence if Marcus ever told anyone. "He said no one would believe me anyway," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "Said it would just make things worse if I tried to report it, so I just kept quiet. Tried to forget." Teresa pulled her son into a fierce hug, her own tears falling into his hair. "Oh, baby. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." When they finally pulled apart, Teresa's expression had changed from anguish to determination. She picked up her phone and started searching. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, wiping his eyes. "Calling a civil rights attorney," she replied, her voice steel hard. "And then, I'm calling that FBI hotline mentioned in the article. This ends now." Within hours, Marcus found himself sitting in a private room at the local FBI field office. 2 agents, one male, one female, sat across from him, their expressions professional but kind. "Take your time, Marcus," the female agent, who had introduced herself as Agent Chen, said gently. "Just tell us everything you remember." Marcus took a deep breath and began recounting that night in detail. The route he'd taken home from robotics practice, the exact spot where Danner had stopped him, the things the officer had said during those terrifying hours in the cruiser. The male agent, Agent Torres, took careful notes while Agent Chen asked clarifying questions. They recorded his statement, photographed the robotics team ID he'd tried to show Danner that night, and collected the GPS data from his old phone that would help establish the timeline. "You're very brave for coming forward," Agent Chen said when they finished. "We know how difficult this must be." Marcus looked down at his hands. "I just keep thinking, if I'd said something back then, maybe that little girl wouldn't have gone through the same thing." "This isn't your fault," Agent Torres said firmly. "The only person responsible is Officer Danner, and thanks to you and Amira, he won't be able to do this to anyone else." Across town in Amira's cozy apartment, Ibrahim's phone rang. He recognized the number as belonging to the task force investigating Danner. "Assistant Director Suleiman," he answered, stepping into his study. "Sir, we just got a new witness," the agent reported. "Teenager, same story, same officer, different year." Ibrahim's hand tightened on the phone as he listened to the details. When the call ended, he walked back to the living room, where Amira sat working on a new drawing, this one showing a bear protecting a young fox from a storm. "Amira," he said softly, sitting beside her, "you may have just opened the door for others." She looked up at him, her dark eyes wise beyond their years. "Someone else who met Officer Danner?" Ibrahim nodded. "Yes. And because you were brave enough to tell your story, they found the courage to tell theirs too." Amira turned back to her drawing, adding careful details to the bear's protective stance. "Good," she said simply. "Nobody should have to wait in the rain alone." The morning news flickered across the TV screen in Amira's living room, casting a blue glow on her face as she sat cross-legged on the couch. Ibrahim stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of the sofa, watching as their local station covered the breaking story. The weight of the moment hung in the air between them, a shared tension neither could fully express. Officer Richard Danner, a veteran of the police force for over 15 years, has been suspended pending investigation, the news anchor reported, her voice professionally neutral despite the gravity of her words. The suspension follows an incident involving the unlawful detention of a 9-year-old girl outside the public library. The screen split to show various social media reactions, a digital battlefield of opposing viewpoints. Some defended Danner, praising his long service record and suggesting the incident was being blown out of proportion. Others called for immediate action, demanding accountability and systemic change. The divide was clear and harsh, with little middle ground to be found. "He was just doing his job," one comment read, highlighted in bold text. "This is what happens when we tie officers' hands." A 9-year-old girl outside a library? This is exactly what's wrong with policing, another countered, the words seeming to leap off the screen. Ibrahim reached for the remote and turned off the TV with a gentle click. "That's enough of that for now," he said gently, noticing how Amira's shoulders had tensed beneath her favorite blue sweater. He resisted the urge to shield her completely. She needed to understand what was happening, but there were limits to what a child should have to bear. At school, the atmosphere was different, charged with whispers and stares. As Amira walked through the hallways, she could feel eyes following her, the burden of sudden notoriety weighing on her small frame. Some kids whispered behind their hands, their curious glances darting away when she looked in their direction, while others pointed openly. A group of older students gave her thumbs up as she passed, their silent support a small comfort in the storm of attention. "My mom says you're really brave," one girl said during lunch, sliding her tray next to Amira's with an encouraging smile. "Well, my dad says people are making too big a deal about nothing," another student countered loudly from across the table, his voice carrying intentionally. In Ms. Paxton's class, the tension was palpable, thick enough to touch. The teacher's lips were pressed into a thin line as she handed back assignments, her movements stiff and deliberate. When she reached Amira's desk, she paused, hovering over the girl like a storm cloud. "I hope all this attention isn't affecting your schoolwork," Ms. Paxton said, her voice carrying across the quiet classroom like a warning. "Sometimes these things get blown so out of proportion, don't they?" Her tone suggested this was precisely what she believed was happening. Before Amira could respond, Lily spoke up from the desk next to her, her voice clear and unwavering. "I don't think standing up for what's right is ever out of proportion, Ms. Paxton." The teacher's face flushed a deep crimson, but she moved on without comment, her silence more telling than any words. Under her desk, Lily reached over and squeezed Amira's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You're not alone," she whispered, her eyes fierce with loyalty. "Not ever." After school, Ibrahim called Amira into his home office. The room was warm and familiar, with its walls of books and the smell of coffee that always seemed to linger, a sanctuary amid the chaos their lives had become. He gestured for her to sit in the comfortable chair across from his desk, the one where she often curled up to read while he worked. "We need to talk about what's happening," he said, his voice gentle but serious, the voice he used for important conversations. "The investigation into Officer Danner is going to be a big thing. There will be meetings with lawyers, and you might need to tell your story again." He watched her carefully, gauging her reaction. Amira nodded, her fingers playing with the edge of her shirt, twisting the fabric into tiny spirals. "The FBI and Department of Justice are taking this very seriously," Ibrahim continued, leaning forward slightly. "But it won't be easy. Some people won't want things to change. They might say unkind things about you, about us." He hated having to prepare his daughter for this, but she deserved the truth. "Like the people on TV?" Amira asked quietly, her voice small but steady. "Yes, like them. But there are also many people who understand why this is important. People who want to help make things better." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering certainty. "What happened to you wasn't right and it wasn't your fault. But now we have a chance to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids." "I know," Amira said, her voice small but steady, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "I promise to be brave." Ibrahim's eyes softened, pride swelling in his chest. "You already are, Habibti. You already are." The Arabic term of endearment hung in the air between them, a reminder of the heritage that connected them. Later that afternoon, Ibrahim sat at his desk, composing an official statement. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as he chose his words carefully, aware that each one carried weight and consequence. As both an FBI assistant director and a father, I stand firmly behind my daughter Amira and all children who have faced similar injustices. What happened that Saturday morning outside our public library represents not just a single incident, but a pattern that must be addressed. The investigation into Officer Danner's actions will be thorough and transparent. Justice must be served not only for Amira, but for every child who has ever been made to feel they don't belong in their own community. He paused, reading over his words, knowing they would soon be scrutinized by thousands. With a deep breath, he pressed send. That evening, over a dinner of homemade pasta, Amira pushed her food around her plate thoughtfully, the fork making little patterns in the sauce. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft clink of silverware and the distant sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. "Dad?" she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Remember my story about the girl and her umbrella?" Ibrahim set down his fork, giving her his full attention. Of course. He remembered how she'd written it after a particularly rainy week, a tale about a girl who found courage in the storm. I think maybe I could make it into a real book, for other kids who might feel scared or alone." She looked up at him uncertainly, vulnerability etched across her features. "Do you think that's silly?" A warm smile spread across Ibrahim's face, reaching all the way to his eyes. "That's not silly at all. I think it's a beautiful idea." He reached across the table to cover her small hand with his larger one. "Really?" Amira's eyes lit up, a spark of excitement cutting through the weariness of the day. "Really," he assured her, his voice filled with conviction. "And I'll help you make it happen. We can work on it together." He could already envision her story touching the lives of other children, spreading ripples of hope and understanding. Amira smiled, the first real smile he'd seen all day, and took a proper bite of her pasta. Outside their window, the sky was clearing after days of rain, and a few early stars were beginning to shine, pinpricks of light in the gathering darkness. The Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, a stark contrast to the rain-soaked days that had marked the beginning of this journey. Outside the precinct, what had started as a small gathering of families affected by Officer Danner's actions had swelled into something much larger. Dozens, then hundreds of people gathered, holding signs and sharing stories. Amira stood close to her father, her small hand wrapped tightly in his. She wore her favorite purple sweater and clutched her sketchbook against her chest like a shield. The crowd made her nervous, but Ibrahim's steady presence kept her grounded. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Reporters with microphones and cameras moved through the crowd, capturing the moment. Amira watched as mothers, fathers, and children stepped forward to share their experiences. "My son was just walking home from school," one mother said into a microphone, her voice trembling with emotion. "Officer Danner stopped him, searched him, humiliated him. No reason, no record of it ever happening." Another parent stepped forward. "My daughter was waiting for me outside the grocery store. Danner accused her of loitering. She was 12. The stories continued, each one echoing pieces of Amira's own experience. She squeezed her father's hand tighter, and he squeezed back, a silent reminder that she was safe. Through the crowd, a tall teenager made his way toward them. He moved carefully, almost hesitantly, and Amira recognized him from the news coverage. Marcus Ellison. He stopped a few feet away, looking uncertain. "Hi," he said softly. "I'm Marcus. I saw your story on the news." Amira nodded, staying close to her father. Ibrahim gave Marcus an encouraging smile. "Can I sit with you for a bit?" Marcus asked, gesturing to a nearby bench. "If that's okay?" Ibrahim looked down at Amira, letting her make the choice. She nodded, and they moved to the bench together. "I was scared to talk about what happened to me," Marcus said, his voice quiet but steady. "For 2 years I kept it inside. Every time I saw a police car, my heart would race. I'd take different routes home, avoid certain streets. Amira opened her sketchbook, her fingers tracing the outline of her latest drawing, a bear holding an umbrella over a rabbit. "But then I saw you," Marcus continued. "I saw how brave you were standing up to him, and I realized I couldn't be quiet anymore. None of us can." "I was scared too," Amira admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus smiled gently. "Being scared doesn't mean you're not brave. Sometimes being brave means doing something even when you're terrified." Ibrahim, seeing Amira engaged in conversation with Marcus, stepped away to join a group of community leaders who had gathered near the precinct steps. His voice, though measured, carried clearly through the morning air. "What happened to my daughter isn't an isolated incident," he said, his words drawing the attention of nearby reporters. "The stories we're hearing today prove that. This isn't just about one officer or one department. This is about a system that needs to change." Amira looked up from her sketchbook, watching her father address the crowd. His shoulders were straight, his expression determined. "We're not just fighting for justice in my daughter's case," Ibrahim continued. "We're fighting for every child who has ever been made to feel they don't belong in their own community. We're fighting for every parent who has had to have the talk with their children about how to survive an encounter with law enforcement. We're fighting for change that will protect all our children." Pride swelled in Amira's chest as she listened to her father speak. She had never seen him like this before, not just as her dad or as an FBI assistant director, but as someone fighting for something bigger than themselves. Marcus noticed her expression. "Your dad's pretty amazing," he said. "Yeah," Amira agreed softly. "He is." The protest continued peacefully throughout the morning, with more families coming forward to share their stories. News cameras captured it all, broadcasting the gathering across local and national networks. As the crowd began to disperse in the early afternoon, there was a sense that something important had begun, a conversation that couldn't be silenced. The next morning, while Amira sat at the kitchen table drawing, Ibrahim brought in the mail. Among the usual envelopes was an official letter addressed to Amira Suleiman. Her father handed it to her, and she opened it carefully. The letterhead showed the school district's logo. Amira's eyes moved slowly across the words. "Dear Miss Suleiman, we write to extend our sincere apology for our failure to properly support you during your recent ordeal. Our lack of response and sensitivity to your situation was inappropriate and inconsistent with our mission to protect and nurture all students. The school district is immediately implementing new policies regarding student safety and racial equality. These changes will include mandatory training for all staff members and clear protocols for supporting students who experience trauma or discrimination. Your courage has helped us recognize where we need to do better. We are committed to creating an environment where every student feels safe, valued, and supported. Sincerely, ... Amira read the letter twice, then looked up at her father, who had been watching her carefully. For the first time in weeks, she felt something shift inside her. A lightness, a possibility. Maybe things really could change. Maybe her voice and the voices of all the others who had spoken up really did matter. "They're listening," she said quietly, touching the letter with gentle fingers. Ibrahim smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Yes, they are." A week after the protest, Ibrahim sat in his office at the FBI headquarters, surrounded by stacks of case files. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across his desk. Each file represented a life touched by Officer Danner's actions, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. Special Agent Rivera knocked on his door, carrying another box of documents. "Sir, we've found something you need to see." She laid out a series of complaints dating back 15 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Young people of color stopped without cause, detained without documentation, threatened into silence. Some cases had notes scribbled in the margins, "Matter resolved internally" or "No further action required." Each note bore Colonel McConnell's signature. Ibrahim's jaw tightened as he read through the testimonies. A 13-year-old girl stopped while walking her dog. A group of black teenagers questioned while studying in the park. A young boy detained for suspicious behavior while waiting for his mother outside a grocery store. The stories echoed Amira's experience with haunting similarity. "How many?" Ibrahim asked, his voice steady despite his rising anger. "We've confirmed 47 cases so far," Rivera replied, "and those are just the ones who filed formal complaints. There could be hundreds more who stayed silent." Ibrahim stood up, straightening his tie. "Set up the meeting with the DOJ today." 3 hours later, Ibrahim sat in a conference room at the Department of Justice. The walls were lined with serious-faced officials, all listening intently as he presented the evidence. "This isn't just about one officer," Ibrahim explained, his voice carrying the weight of both professional authority and personal investment. Danner's actions were enabled by a system designed to protect him. Colonel McConnell deliberately buried complaints. The precinct leadership turned a blind eye. This goes beyond individual misconduct. It's institutional failure. The DOJ officials exchanged glances. The head of the Civil Rights Division spoke up. "What are you proposing, Assistant Director Suleiman?" "A full federal investigation," Ibrahim replied without hesitation. "Not just into Danner, but into the entire command structure. We need to examine every case, every complaint, every instance where the system failed these families." The room fell silent for a moment before the Attorney General nodded. "Approved. You'll have whatever resources you need." As news of the federal investigation broke, media attention intensified. Local news stations ran special reports on police oversight. National newspapers published editorials calling for reform. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice and accountability. Ibrahim's office began receiving calls from families across the state. Each had a story to tell, a voice that had been silenced for too long, a mother whose son had been wrongfully detained, a father whose daughter had been intimidated into dropping charges, teenagers who had been profiled, harassed, threatened. One afternoon, as Ibrahim reviewed testimonies with his team, his secretary interrupted. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says his name is James Carter." A middle-aged black man entered the office, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a worn manila envelope. "My son. This happened to him 5 years ago. Officer Danner picked him up outside his school. Kept him in the car for hours. We tried to file a complaint, but Colonel McConnell intervened," Ibrahim finished softly. Mr. Carter nodded, tears in his eyes. "When we saw what happened to your daughter, what you're doing now, we knew we had to come forward. There are others, so many others." Throughout all of this, Amira attended meetings with her father when she could. She sat quietly in the back of conference rooms, listening to testimonies, watching as more and more people found the courage to speak up. She noticed how they looked at her, not with pity but with gratitude and admiration. At one community meeting, a young girl about her age approached her. "My brother was stopped by that officer last year," she said. "He was so scared afterward he quit the basketball team because practice ended after dark. But after seeing you on TV, he's playing again. You made him brave." Amira felt the weight of these words, of all the stories she'd heard, of all the lives connected to hers through this shared experience of injustice. She opened her sketchbook, which was now filled with new drawings. Not just animals with umbrellas, but people standing together, protecting each other, sharing their stories. That evening, Amira sat with her father in their living room. The TV was muted, showing footage of another protest outside the precinct. Her sketchbook lay open on her lap, pages filled with the illustrations that had become her way of processing everything that had happened. She took a deep breath, looking up at her father with determination in her eyes. "I want to write the book, Dad," she said firmly. "I think the world needs to hear it. I can't be afraid anymore." Ibrahim looked at his daughter, seeing not just the little girl who loved to draw, but a young person who understood the power of her voice. He smiled warmly, pride evident in his expression. "Then let's do it," he replied. "Together." In the weeks following the federal investigation's launch, the precinct's legal team reached out to Ibrahim through official channels. The department, facing mounting pressure and damaging evidence, was eager to settle. Ibrahim sat at his kitchen table one evening, reviewing the preliminary settlement offer while Amira worked on her drawings nearby. "They're willing to pay quite a bit," Ibrahim said carefully, watching his daughter's reaction. "But before we go any further, I want to know what you think we should do with it." Amira looked up from her sketchbook, her expression thoughtful. She had been thinking about this for days, ever since her father first mentioned the possibility of a settlement. "I don't want the money for us," she said firmly. "I want it to help other kids like me." She pulled out a folder filled with carefully drawn plans and written notes. Ibrahim smiled, recognizing his daughter's meticulous attention to detail. Amira spread the papers across the table, revealing her vision for community programs focused on education, literacy, and youth protection. "We need safe spaces," she explained, pointing to her drawings. "Places where kids can read and draw and just be themselves, especially kids who feel like they don't belong." Ibrahim studied the plans, noting how his daughter had thought through every aspect. "You've put a lot of thought into this," he said softly. "I keep thinking about that morning," Amira replied. "If the library had been open, if there had been somewhere safe for me to go." She paused, then continued with determination. "No kid should feel like they don't have a place in the world." Ibrahim immediately began working with the department's lawyers to structure the settlement according to Amira's wishes. Every dollar would be dedicated to community programs, with specific provisions for creating safe spaces for underserved youth. As negotiations proceeded, Amira's vision began taking shape. Local community leaders, inspired by her story and her dedication to helping others, joined the cause. The library board enthusiastically approved plans for a new children's wing, and additional fundraising efforts quickly exceeded their goals. The space would be called Room 17, a name that carried deep significance. Those 17 minutes Amira spent in Danner's police car had changed her life, but now they would stand for something different: hope, creativity, and belonging. At the first design meeting, Amira sat at a large table surrounded by architects, artists, and community organizers. Her sketchbook lay open before her as she shared her ideas. The room would have large windows to let in natural light, comfortable reading nooks, and art supplies always at the ready. Most importantly, it would be staffed by trained mentors who understood the challenges faced by marginalized youth. Marcus, now 17, sat beside her during the meeting. He had become a regular presence in the planning process, offering insights from his own experience and suggesting ways to make the space truly welcoming for teens. "We need to make sure kids know this is their space," he explained to the group. "Not just somewhere they're allowed to be, but somewhere they belong." He glanced at Amira, who nodded in agreement. Local artists and writers volunteered their time and expertise. They developed programs that would combine academic support with creative expression. Marcus, drawing from his own academic strengths, organized a homework help program where older students could mentor younger ones. "It's about more than just getting the right answers," he told Amira as they reviewed the tutoring schedule. "It's about showing kids that learning belongs to them, not to the system." As the opening day approached, Room 17 transformed from a concept into reality. The walls were painted in warm, welcoming colors. Bookshelves were filled with diverse literature reflecting many cultures and experiences. Art supplies were arranged in accessible stations, and comfortable seating areas invited visitors to stay and create. On the morning of the opening ceremony, the library was filled to capacity. Families who had supported the project stood alongside activists who had marched in the protests. Local government representatives mingled with community organizers. Ibrahim stood proudly beside Amira as she prepared to address the crowd. The room fell silent as Amira stepped up to the microphone. She held her original sketchbook, the one she had been drawing in that rainy morning, close to her chest. Looking out at the sea of faces, she saw not strangers but a community united in purpose. 6 months ago, she began, her voice clear and steady. I sat in the rain because I had nowhere else to go. I drew pictures of animals with umbrellas because I needed to believe that even in the storm, there was shelter to be found. She paused, looking around the room that had grown from her experience. Today we're opening more than just a room, she continued. We're creating a shelter for every kid who's ever felt like they don't belong. A place where their stories matter, where their art has meaning, where their dreams have room to grow." She gestured to the space around her with its bright windows and welcoming atmosphere. "In room 17, no one will ever tell you that you don't belong. No one will ever make you feel like you need to be invisible. This is your space to learn, to create, to be exactly who you are." The crowd erupted in applause as Amira, together with her father and Marcus, cut the ribbon across the entrance. The doors opened, and people flooded in for the first official program. Art in the Rain, Stories from the Margins. The opening of Room 17 became more than just a local celebration. News vans lined the street outside the library, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters clutched microphones and notepads, eager to capture the story of how one young girl's traumatic experience had transformed into a beacon of hope for an entire community. Inside the newly renovated space, Amira watched as visitors filled every corner. City council members in pressed suits mingled with community organizers in casual attire. The mayor herself stood near the art station, admiring the wall of children's drawings that had already begun to accumulate. Each piece told a different story, just as Amira's drawings had told hers. National news networks picked up the story, broadcasting images of Room 17 across the country. From injustice to innovation, how a 9-year-old's arrest sparked change, read one headline. Another declared, Room 17, a safe haven born from struggle. The coverage sparked conversations about racial profiling and systemic injustice in communities nationwide. The response was overwhelming. Within days of the opening, donations began pouring in from across the country. Corporate foundations pledged matching funds, while individuals sent whatever they could afford. $5, $20, sometimes just heartfelt letters of support. Each contribution came with a message. This matters. This needs to grow. The Room 17 initiative expanded rapidly. What started as a single room in one library began to evolve into a comprehensive program. Workshop schedules appeared on newly installed bulletin boards. Mentorship sign-up sheets filled with names. After-school activities drew dozens of young participants eager to find their own creative voices. Amira watched it all unfold with a mixture of amazement and purpose. She spent her afternoons in Room 17, sitting with other children as they worked on their projects. Some drew, others wrote stories, and a few simply sat in the comfortable reading nooks, finally feeling safe enough to just be themselves. Marcus, now in his senior year of high school, became a constant presence in Room 17. He developed a workshop series called Speaking Truth, teaching younger kids how to advocate for themselves and others. His own experience with Officer Danner had left him silent for years, but now he helped others find their voices. "Remember," he told a group of middle school students during one session, "your story matters. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you different." The kids looked up at him with wide eyes, hanging on every word. Among them sat a particularly quiet girl named Maya, who barely spoke above a whisper. Maya had been coming to Room 17 for weeks, always choosing the most secluded corner to read or write. One afternoon, she approached Amira with trembling hands and a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," she said softly. "Because of your book about the animals with umbrellas." Amira read Maya's story, a beautiful tale about a butterfly who learned to fly in the rain. The words were simple but powerful, speaking of courage and persistence. Maya had even drawn small illustrations in the margins, just as Amira did in her own work. Ibrahim observed all of this from his position as both father and federal agent. He watched as Room 17 became exactly what Amira had envisioned, a sanctuary where creativity and healing intertwined. The changes he saw weren't just in the physical space or the programs offered, but in the children themselves. Kids who had once been afraid to speak now raised their hands in workshops. Those who had felt invisible now proudly displayed their artwork on the walls. Late one evening, as Amira and Ibrahim sat at their kitchen table sharing a plate of cookies, they reflected on everything that had happened since that rainy Saturday morning. The table was covered with newspaper clippings about Room 17 and letters from supporters across the country. "Did you ever think," Ibrahim asked, watching his daughter dunk a cookie in her milk. That your drawings would lead to all this? Amira shook her head, considering the question carefully. I just wanted to make something beautiful, she said, even when things weren't beautiful. The next morning, as Amira prepared for school, the mail arrived early. Among the usual stack of envelopes was a thick cream-colored one addressed specifically to her. The return address showed one of the country's most prestigious children's book publishers. With slightly shaking hands, Amira opened the letter while her father watched. The publisher had seen her story in the news and had received samples of her work through Ibrahim's contact. They were impressed not just by her artistic talent, but by the depth of emotion in her simple drawings of animals helping each other through the rain. We believe your story needs to be told, the letter read. Not just the events that led to Room 17, but the beautiful way you chose to express your experience through art. We would be honored to help you create a children's book that captures both your drawings and your message of hope and resilience. Amira looked up from the letter, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her father stood nearby, his own eyes glistening with pride and emotion. Without a word, she rushed into his arms, the letter still clutched in her hand. They held each other tightly, both understanding that this was another beginning, another way to spread the message of Room 17. This is really happening, isn't it? Amira whispered into her father's chest, her voice full of wonder and determination. Ibrahim held his daughter close, remembering the scared little girl in the police car, the brave child who spoke at protests, and now the young artist whose work would touch countless other children. Through her simple drawings of animals with umbrellas, she had found a way to shelter others from their own storms. The courthouse loomed large and imposing on the morning of Officer Danner's trial. Television crews clustered around the entrance, their cameras trained on the steady stream of people filing through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air felt thick with tension as prosecutors arranged their files, and spectators filled the wooden benches. Amira sat between her father and Marcus in the front row, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a neat blue dress that her mother had picked out specially for the occasion, and her hair was pulled back with careful precision. The courtroom's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces around her. The defense attorney, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit, presented Danner as a dedicated public servant who had spent decades protecting the community. She spoke about his years of service, his commendations, his role as a father himself. Officer Danner, she declared, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom, was simply doing his job that morning. He saw what he believed to be suspicious activity and acted according to protocol. The media seized on these statements. Conservative news outlets ran headlines defending Danner's actions, painting him as a victim of cancel culture and anti-police sentiment. They questioned why a routine stop had escalated into a federal case. Some commentators suggested that Ibrahim's position in the FBI had unfairly influenced the investigation. But the evidence told a different story. The prosecution methodically presented their case: the unauthorized arrest, the disabled body camera, the missing dispatch logs. They showed surveillance footage from nearby businesses that captured Danner driving in circles with Amira in his custody. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating a damning picture of abuse of power. At school, Amira faced renewed attention. Some students whispered behind their hands as she passed in the hallways. Others offered quiet words of support or simple smiles. She held her head high, remembering the strength she'd found in Room 17, where children continued to gather and create despite the storm of controversy. The trial's turning point came during Marcus's testimony. He sat in the witness stand, his hands steady, but his voice occasionally catching as he recounted his encounter with Danner 2 years earlier. He described being handcuffed and driven around for hours, terrified and alone. "He told me nobody would believe me," Marcus testified, his words echoing in the silent courtroom. "He said I should know my place, that kids like me were always up to no good. I was wearing my robotics team jacket. I had my competition medal in my backpack, but he didn't see any of that, he just saw what he wanted to see." As Marcus spoke, several jurors wiped away tears. Even some of Danner's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The raw honesty of his testimony cut through the political rhetoric and legal arguments, laying bare the human cost of Danner's actions. Amira watched Marcus's testimony with a mixture of pride and sadness. She saw how his hands trembled slightly as he pointed to identify Danner, how his voice grew stronger as he continued to speak. She understood the courage it took to sit there, to face the man who had hurt him, to tell his story in front of all these strangers. That evening, sitting at their kitchen table, Amira confessed her conflicted feelings to her father. "I don't want Officer Danner to go to jail," she said quietly, pushing her dinner around her plate. "But I don't want him to hurt any more kids either." Ibrahim pulled his chair closer to his daughter's. "This isn't about making anyone suffer," he explained gently. "It's about accountability and change. Sometimes justice looks like consequences, but its real purpose is prevention. We're not doing this to punish Officer Danner. We're doing this to protect other children." As the trial progressed, more evidence emerged. Internal affairs documents revealed a pattern of complaints against Danner that had been systematically buried. Former colleagues testified about his behavior, breaking the blue wall of silence. The prosecution presented psychological evaluations suggesting a long-standing pattern of racial bias and abuse of authority. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed. Journalists leaned forward in their seats, pens poised above notepads. Danner sat stiffly at the defense table, his face unreadable as the jury foreman stood. "On the count of official misconduct in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." A collective intake of breath. "On the count of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty." Amira felt her father's hand tighten around hers. "On the count of falsifying public records, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions: sighs of relief, muffled sobs, angry mutters. Amira watched as Danner's shoulders slumped slightly, the first crack in his rigid posture. His family in the back row held each other, crying quietly. Standing beside her father outside the courthouse afterward, Amira faced the wall of cameras and microphones. She didn't smile or cry. She simply stood tall, her face showing the quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. Ibrahim's hand rested protectively on her shoulder as reporters called out questions and cameras flashed. The verdict dominated the evening news. Some celebrated it as a victory for accountability, while others decried it as an attack on law enforcement. But for Amira, standing in the fading light of the courthouse steps, it felt neither like a victory nor a defeat. It felt like a necessary step in a longer journey, one that had begun with a little girl drawing animals with umbrellas, waiting in the rain. The years had transformed Room 17 from a simple library space into something extraordinary. 9 years after that rainy morning that changed everything, 18-year-old Amira stood before the bare wall, her artistic vision clear in her mind. The city's commission for a mural felt like coming full circle, a permanent marker of how far they'd come. She traced her fingers along the rough brick surface, remembering the scared 9-year-old who once sat drawing animals with umbrellas. Now, as a high school senior headed to art school in the fall, she had the chance to turn that memory into something powerful. The wall stretched 20 feet high and 40 feet wide, a canvas that intimidated even experienced artists. But Amira felt ready. She'd spent weeks sketching designs, consulting with the community, and working with a team of local artists who would help bring her vision to life. The central image came to her naturally, a young girl standing in the rain, umbrella raised high, surrounded by books that fell like raindrops around her. Each book would bear the title of a story that had emerged from Room 17 over the years. Stories of triumph, of standing up to injustice, of finding one's voice. "What do you think?" Amira asked Marcus, now a law student who still volunteered at Room 17 whenever he could. He studied her preliminary sketch, nodding slowly. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It captures everything this place stands for." The painting process began on a warm spring morning. Professional muralists worked alongside community volunteers, following Amira's detailed plans. She insisted on mixing the colors herself, wanting to get the exact shade of purple for the umbrella, the same color as the one she'd carried that fateful day. People gathered daily to watch the mural take shape. Parents brought their children, pointing out details as they emerged. Teachers brought their classes to witness art and history being made. Even some of the original protesters who had supported Amira's cause years ago came to see their movement immortalized in paint. The figure of the girl slowly emerged, her face turned slightly upward, radiating quiet determination. Around her, the books seemed to dance in the painted rain, their titles carefully rendered. The Tiger's Umbrella, Amira's own published children's book, Speaking Truth, Marcus's memoir about youth activism, Room 17 Stories, an anthology of works by young writers who'd found their voice in the program. Local news crews came to document the process, interviewing Amira about the symbolism behind each element. She spoke with confidence now, years of public speaking having smoothed away her childhood shyness. The rain in the mural isn't just rain, she explained to one reporter. It represents the challenges we face, but the umbrella, the books, the community, they show how we can turn those challenges into something beautiful. Ibrahim visited often during the painting, watching proudly as his daughter directed artists and explained her vision. He remembered the little girl who'd once clutched her sketchbook for comfort, now standing tall as an artist and leader in her own right. After 3 weeks of work, the mural neared completion. The details were stunning, the way the light seemed to catch the falling raindrops, the subtle shadows cast by the floating books, the determined set of the girl's shoulders. But most striking was the sense of hope that radiated from the entire piece. The unveiling ceremony drew hundreds of people. The street in front of Room 17 was closed off to accommodate the crowd. Chairs were set up facing the covered mural, quickly filling with community members, activists, local officials, and families whose lives had been touched by the program. The mayor spoke first, acknowledging the transformation that had begun with one brave child's stand against injustice. Other speakers followed, community leaders, educators, young people who'd found their voice through Room 17's programs. When it was Amira's turn to speak, she approached the podium with measured steps. She wore a deep purple dress, an intentional echo of her childhood umbrella. The crowd fell silent as she adjusted the microphone. 9 years ago, I sat in the rain drawing pictures of animals with umbrellas, she began, her voice clear and strong. I didn't know then that those simple drawings would become something so much bigger, that they would help me find my voice and help others find theirs. She paused, looking out at the familiar faces in the crowd. Room 17 taught me that our voices matter, that our stories deserve to be told. But more importantly, it showed me that when we stand together, we can turn our struggles into strength. This mural isn't just about what happened to me. It's about every person who's ever felt silenced, every child who's needed shelter from their own storm. As she spoke, volunteers prepared to remove the tarp covering the mural. The girl in this mural is holding up her umbrella not just to protect herself, but to create a space where others can gather, where stories can be shared, where change can begin. At her signal, the tarp fell away. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the mural was revealed in its full glory, sunlight catching the metallic paint that made the raindrops shimmer. The image towered above them, powerful, hopeful, transformative. Amira stood before the mural, surrounded by the community that had supported her journey. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, just as it had outside the courthouse years ago. Marcus stood nearby with some of the younger Room 17 regulars who looked up to him as a mentor. Her mother, who had worked so hard to give her every opportunity, wiped proud tears from her eyes. The umbrella in the mural seemed to glow with its own light, a beacon of protection and possibility. It was no longer just a shield from the storm. It had become a symbol of something much greater. Looking up at her creation, Amira felt the truth of what Room 17 had become, not just a place, but a movement. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as hundreds of graduating seniors sat in their royal blue caps and gowns. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting a warm glow over the crowd of proud families and friends. Principal Matthews stood at the podium reading names from a long list of graduates. Amira Suleiman. The applause that erupted was thunderous, far beyond the usual polite clapping for each graduate. People rose to their feet, creating a wave of standing ovations that swept through the auditorium. In the front row, Ibrahim Suleiman stood tall, his eyes glistening with pride. Beside him, Layla dabbed at her tears with a tissue, while Marcus, who had taken time off from law school to attend, whistled and cheered. Amira walked across the stage with measured steps, her head held high. She'd grown taller over the years, but there was still something of that thoughtful 9-year-old girl in her bearing, the same quiet determination, the same gentle strength. Her graduation gown swished softly as she moved, the gold honor cords around her neck glinting in the sunlight. As she accepted her diploma, Principal Matthews gestured for her to stay at the podium. This had been planned, but Amira still felt butterflies in her stomach as she faced the crowd. She adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. 9 years ago, I sat under an awning in the rain, drawing pictures of animals with umbrellas, she began, her voice clear and steady. I was just a little girl who loved art and stories. I never imagined that morning would change not just my life, but the lives of so many others. The audience fell silent, hanging on her words. Many knew her story. It had become almost legendary in their community, but hearing it from her carried a different weight. When Officer Danner put me in that police car, I was scared. I felt alone. But that moment taught me something important. Sometimes the hardest experiences can lead us to our greatest purpose. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Room 17 started as a response to injustice, but it grew into something more beautiful than we could have imagined. It became a sanctuary where kids could be themselves, where their voices matter, where their stories are heard. Ibrahim watched his daughter from the front row, his heart swelling with pride. He remembered the countless nights they'd spent working together, fighting for justice, building something meaningful from their pain. Now, watching her command the stage with such grace and wisdom, he saw the full measure of her growth. As I stand here today graduating with my class, I'm not just celebrating my academic achievements. I'm celebrating every person who stood with us, who believed in the power of change, who helped turn a moment of darkness into years of light. Amira's voice grew stronger, more passionate. Room 17 taught me that we all have the power to make a difference no matter how young we are, that our stories matter, that our voices count. The applause that followed her speech was deafening. As she returned to her seat, her phone buzzed in the pocket of her gown. She waited until the ceremony concluded before checking it, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the publisher's name. The message was simple but profound. It's official. Your book goes to print next week. Congratulations, Amira. The world needs your story. She looked up at her father, who had made his way through the crowd to reach her. Without words, she showed him the message. His face broke into a wide smile, and he pulled her into a tight hug. This was their victory, not just hers but theirs. Every late night spent editing, every careful revision, every conversation about how to tell their story in a way that would resonate with children everywhere. It had all led to this moment. Later that evening, after the celebrations had wound down, Amira stood at the entrance of Room 17. The space had evolved over the years, but its heart remained the same. Children sat at tables, some drawing, others reading, all of them safe and supported. The walls were covered with artwork and stories created by the kids who had found their voice here. The mural she'd designed still dominated the main wall, its colors as vibrant as ever. The girl with the umbrella seemed to watch over the room like a guardian angel, reminding everyone who entered that they had the power to weather any storm. Through the windows, Amira could see rain beginning to fall, a gentle summer shower that made the world outside look soft and clean. The sight brought a smile to her face. Rain no longer held fear for her. Instead, it reminded her of how far they'd come. Inside Room 17, a young girl was showing her latest drawing to Marcus, who had become a regular mentor when he wasn't busy with law school. Another group of kids huddled around a table, working on their submissions for the Room 17 literary magazine. A boy who reminded Amira of herself at that age sat quietly in a corner, sketching in a notebook. The space hummed with creative energy, with possibility, with hope. Room 17 had become exactly what they'd dreamed it could be. A sanctuary where creativity flourished, where differences were celebrated, where every child knew they belonged. Amira stood there taking it all in, feeling the weight of the graduation cap still on her head, and the phone with the publisher's message still in her pocket. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside room 17 everyone was safe and dry, protected by something stronger than any umbrella, the power of community, of story, of belonging. The university campus sprawled before Amira as she walked to her morning class, her backpack heavy with textbooks on social justice theory and public policy. At 19, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed when she was that scared 9-year-old in the back of Officer Danner's cruiser. The autumn air was crisp, and students hurried past her on their way to various buildings, some giving her small waves of recognition. Her first semester courses were demanding, but Amira found herself thoroughly engaged in the material. During her social movements and change lecture, she often caught herself drawing parallels between the historical cases they studied and her own experience with Room 17. Sometimes, when professors discussed grassroots organizing, she'd share insights from her personal journey, earning interested looks from her classmates. Between classes, Amira would find quiet spots in the university library to study. The space reminded her of Room 17, though it felt different, more formal, less intimate. She'd catch herself thinking about the kids back home, wondering how they were doing, hoping they still felt safe and supported in the space she'd helped create. The transition to university life hadn't been easy. Despite her accomplishments, Amira felt the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. She knew there was still so much work to be done, so many more children who needed protection and support. During late-night study sessions, she'd sometimes pause to look at photos of Room 17 on her phone, drawing strength from the memories of what they'd built. Back in their hometown, Room 17 continued to flourish under Marcus's guidance. He'd grown into his role as a mentor, using his law school knowledge to help kids understand their rights, while encouraging them to express themselves through art and writing. The space had become even more vibrant, with new programs and workshops running almost daily. One evening, as Amira was reviewing notes for her policy implementation midterm, her phone lit up with Marcus's call. She smiled, setting aside her textbook to answer. "You won't believe what we're planning," Marcus said, his voice excited. "We're starting a summer internship program at Room 17. Real hands-on experience in social justice work, education, and activism for the kids." Amira sat up straighter in her chair, her heart quickening with interest. "Tell me more," she said, reaching for her notebook to jot down details. Marcus explained how the program would work. 10 weeks of structured learning and practical experience, with each intern paired with a mentor from various fields of social justice work. They'd learn about community organizing, education reform, and advocacy while working on real projects that affected their community. "It's exactly what Room 17 needs," Amira said, her voice warm with approval. "It's giving kids more than just a safe space. It's giving them tools to create change." Later that evening, Ibrahim called to check on her. Their conversations had evolved since she'd started university, becoming more like discussions between equals than father-daughter talks. They spoke about Room 17's future, with Ibrahim sharing his vision of expanding the initiative to other cities. "Think about it, Amira," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of gentleness and determination. "What we built could help so many more children. Other communities need spaces like Room 17. Amira felt her heart pull in two directions. The idea of expanding Room 17's reach was exciting, but she worried about balancing it with her studies. She wanted to give both her full attention, to do justice to both her education and her mission. "I know it's a lot to think about," Ibrahim added, sensing her conflict. "You don't have to decide anything now. Focus on your studies. Room 17 isn't going anywhere." As she tried to return to her studying that night, Amira's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Lily, her best friend since childhood. Lily had stayed in their hometown, working full-time in youth advocacy, and her message made Amira's heart skip a beat. "Amazing news," Lily's text read. "We've been invited to speak at the National Youth Empowerment Conference. They want us to present on Room 17 and racial justice. Call me ASAP." Amira stared at the message, feeling a surge of pride and excitement. The conference was one of the largest gatherings of youth activists and educators in the country. Having their story heard on such a platform could inspire other communities to create their own versions of Room 17. She called Lily immediately, and they spent an hour discussing the opportunity. Lily's enthusiasm was contagious as she described the conference and its potential impact. As they talked, Amira felt that familiar sense of purpose that had driven her since she was 9 years old. The understanding that her voice mattered, that her story could help others find their own strength. Looking around her dorm room, at the textbooks spread across her desk and the framed photo of Room 17's mural on her wall, Amira felt the pieces of her life clicking into place. She was no longer just the girl who had been wrongfully arrested. She was a student, an activist, a leader. The conference invitation wasn't just recognition of what she'd accomplished. It was an opportunity to take her mission to the next level. The grand auditorium buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of young activists, educators, and community leaders filled the seats. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting warm patterns across the polished stage where Amira, now 24, stood waiting to deliver her keynote address at the Youth for Justice conference. She smoothed her blazer, her fingers brushing against the small enamel pin on her lapel, a purple umbrella, the symbol that had become synonymous with Room 17's movement. The conference program in her hand listed her as Amira Suleiman, founder of Room 17 Initiative, author, and youth justice advocate. Looking out at the audience, Amira saw reflections of herself everywhere, young people with dreams of change, determination etched on their faces. Some clutched notebooks, others had laptops open, but all leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear from the woman whose story had inspired a nationwide movement. In the front row, familiar faces brought comfort. Her father, Ibrahim, sat straight-backed in his suit, pride evident in his gentle smile. Besides him was Marcus, now a practicing civil rights attorney, who had helped expand Room 17's legal education program. Lily sat next to them, her camera ready to document this moment for the youth advocacy organization she now ran. As Amira stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath, remembering the rainy morning that had set everything in motion. The memory no longer brought pain. It had transformed into something powerful, a catalyst for change. 5 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady. I was just a 9-year-old girl with a sketchbook and an umbrella, waiting for the library to open. The words carried across the hushed auditorium, drawing everyone into her story. She spoke about that morning, about Officer Danner, about the fear and confusion. But more importantly, she spoke about what came after, the creation of Room 17, the community that rallied around a child's right to exist safely in public spaces, the movement that grew from one small act of resistance. Change doesn't always announce itself with thunder, Amira continued, warming to her theme. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, with a sketch, with a single person saying, "This isn't right." She shared stories of the children who had found refuge in Room 17, young artists, writers, and activists who had discovered their voices within its walls. She told them about Marcus, who had transformed his trauma into a force for good, mentoring countless youth and fighting for justice in the courtroom. About Lily, whose unwavering friendship had shown her the power of true allyship. About the countless children who had walked through Room 17's doors, carrying their own storms, and found shelter, community, and strength. "We're no longer just waiting in the rain," Amira declared, her voice rising with passion. "We're creating the storm. We're the lightning that illuminates injustice, the thunder that demands to be heard. Every story shared, every piece of art created, every voice raised in protest, these are the droplets that form our downpour of change." She spoke about Room 17's expansion into other cities, about the network of safe spaces that had sprung up across the country. She shared statistics about the impact, the number of youth served, the policy changes enacted, the lives transformed. But more than numbers, she emphasized the human stories, the individual victories that made up the larger movement. "This work isn't about creating perfect solutions," she acknowledged, her tone softening. "It's about building bridges, opening doors, and ensuring that no child ever has to feel alone in their struggle for justice. It's about transforming our pain into power, our fear into fierce determination." As she concluded her speech, Amira looked out at the audience once more. Tears glistened in many eyes, but they were accompanied by determined smiles and nodding heads. The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. After the speech, young people crowded around her, sharing their own stories of injustice and inspiration. A teenage girl from Detroit described how she'd started a Room 17 chapter in her neighborhood. A group of college students wanted advice on implementing youth advocacy programs in their communities. Each conversation reinforced what Amira already knew. The movement was bigger than her now, growing and evolving in beautiful, unexpected ways. As the crowd began to thin, Amira slipped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The afternoon sky had darkened, and a gentle rain had begun to fall, pattering softly against the pavement. The coincidence made her smile. How fitting that it should rain on this day of all days. Standing there, feeling the cool drops on her face, Amira thought about how far she'd come from that scared little girl clutching her sketchbook. The rain no longer represented fear or isolation. Instead, it reminded her of growth, of cleansing, of new beginnings. "We've made it through the storm," she whispered to herself, the words carrying all the weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. The rain continued to fall softly around her, a gentle reminder of where she'd started and how far she'd come. If you enjoyed the story of Amira, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Reminder of where she'd started and how far she'd come. If you enjoyed the story of Amira, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.